Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy, and we will be taking your questions this hour about the murders of 4 University of Idaho students. They are Maddie Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. The man charged with murdering these students last November, Bryan Kohberger, is going to be back in court very soon, in just under 30 minutes or so. And the hearing about this is really going to determine how we can bring you coverage of this case moving forward as it moves toward trial later this year. Bryan Kohberger is asking Judge John Judge to ban cameras from the courtroom. The media has formed a coalition, and that includes us here at Law and Crime, and we are asking that cameras be allowed. We're also asking that the gag order in the case be vacated so we can bring you information about the case. The state and the prosecution want that gag order to remain in place. We have a great panel to answer your questions today. Bobby Chacon is a retired FBI agent and lawyer. Joseph Scott Morgan is a forensic death investigator and the host of the Body Bags podcast. And Michael Bryant is an attorney and host here at the Law and Crime Network. Guys, thanks for being with us today. We have some great questions coming in from our viewers, and we want you to keep those coming. Submit them to us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, and we'll get to as many of them as we can as we move the show forward. But I want to start out with our first question from a viewer, and it comes from Long Beach Mamba from YouTube. Joseph, I'll throw this one to you. This whole case has me confused. So why did they say he allegedly did it? What was his motive? What are they hiding? So there are 3 questions there, Joseph. What do you say to that question from Long Beach Mamba?
Well, Long Beach Mamba, thank you for trusting me with all of this information. That's a lot to unpack in a very short period of time.
It is.
I'll try. First off, there is apparently biological connectivity between Bryan Kohberger and that scene, or at least some of the evidence that they have collected from that scene. And so I think that just from a forensic standpoint is probably the most compelling thing that they have. And we don't know how much of that evidence there is at this point in time. Of course, we've seen videography of them unpacking, the crime scene and hauling a lot of that stuff away, but also his apartment. And let's don't forget the infamous car is out there as well. And so they have possession of all of this stuff. So it sounds like from a physical evidence standpoint, I think that all signs point to him as far as the authorities are concerned. Can I have the next part of the question? I'm sorry.
The next part of the question, I'm sorry to throw that 3-parter at you. Maybe I should have broken it up into a bunch of them. But what was his motive? Joseph, we really don't know a lot about what the prosecution believes was behind this.
No, I don't. And I don't know that anybody outside of that investigative bubble really knows at this point in time. And everything that we say is highly speculative. However, there's indication that there's social media interaction on some level, whether it was the victims interacting with him or him taking notice of them. It is quite compelling, I think. And so that's going to be, again, another bit of circumstantial evidence that might point back to some kind of at least perceived relationship that he may have had with one or more of these victims rather, at this scene.
I think it's important that we note, too, that we don't really know much about, we know what we know from the probable cause affidavit. We don't know what the prosecution is claiming at this point in time, other than they say it was Bryan Kohberger. He, of course, is maintaining his innocence. He says he hopes to be exonerated, and they are moving toward trial, and they will be fighting this as far as we can tell. Michael, I want to go to you for our next question. It comes from Jams Row from YouTube. Do cameras really have that much of an influence over a jury? And Michael, the reason I throw this one to you is because you covered O.J. Simpson and the O.J. Simpson case. So do you think that cameras really have that much of an impact on jurors who are in the courtroom hearing the case and hearing the evidence?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it really comes down to the individual jurors. And I'm not talking about, the run-up to the trial, because anybody in the jury pool arguably can be affected by the publicity prior to being seated in the box. Once they're in the box, hopefully they're not watching or listening to any of that stuff. They're not supposed to. But the physical setting in the courtroom, cameras, even just one camera, and I know in Idaho that's their law, one camera still in video. We're not going to have multiples at best. It does create a different feel. It feels like, you're part of a TV show because, well, you are. So I don't know that it's a negative impact, but it would be wrong to say there isn't some impact, that it doesn't affect jurors in some way, that maybe they're more concerned about being identified sooner rather than later. It has an impact. I think we would all be arguing today it's not a negative impact, and that's kind of the nature of the arguments in front of the court today.
Mm-hmm. And that is a big part of the argument before the court today. Bryan Kohberger doesn't want cameras in his trial or in future hearings. The media has formed a coalition, including Law and Crime. We are asking that cameras be allowed. We think it's really important, and this is an important case. Bobby Chacon, I'm going to send this question to you. You're a retired FBI agent and a lawyer. Marley Glasheen from Facebook asks, what is a gag order? There is a gag order in this case that both the prosecution and the defense agreed to when the charges were first filed.
Yeah, and actually the gag order in this case goes even further. I believe it applies to the families of the victims, which is kind of unusual. And so a gag order simply means that in most cases, the prosecution and the defense, anybody on those teams, the lawyers, the representatives of the people themselves, cannot comment publicly on the case, on the evidence. No documents can be released, no statements can be made, and in this case, both the defense and the prosecution supported that gag order. The family, however, at least one of the families does not. They've been more vocal, at least in the early part of this investigation. So I think the gag order even applies down the line to the family who are, potential witnesses in this case.
Mm-hmm. And that's the family of Kaylee Gonsalves. Her father, Steve Gonsalves, and mother, Christy, were very outspoken in the beginning of this. You'll recall, as we were covering this back in November and December, even January, Steve Gonsalves wanted answers, and he wasn't getting the answers that he felt he was entitled to or that he deserved. And he gave many, many interviews, and he was very frustrated with the pace of the investigation. Joseph, something I want to ask you about with regard to that, I think we can all understand all of the families feeling frustrated at points in time with not getting information. And we were frustrated as people covering this who were not getting any information at all from the authorities. We were getting a lot of talking points and we're continuing the investigation. But that really is to keep the integrity of the investigation in place. They don't put out a lot of information, and they may not have had a lot of solid information to put out.
Yeah, it's quite possible. And we also have to take another factor into consideration. The fabric of this case is different than many others. You're talking about arguably one of the most horrific crimes that's certainly taken place in this area of Idaho. You've got a local law enforcement body or multiple bodies there, and I'm talking about the locals, that have little or no experience in something, this large, this broad, if you will. And it is a bit intimidating. And sometimes, the old adage about sometimes it's better to keep your mouth shut. And I think that's probably one of the little factors that's involved in here. So, yeah, we all wanted information. I can't imagine what the family was going through at that moment in time, and I do appreciate his frustration, the family's frustration. However, it is better to not reveal too much, before flying the metaphorical plane into the side of the mountain when the investigation, just so that you can satiate whatever desires other people might have that are not within that investigative bubble.
And just so people understand how small Moscow, Idaho is, the population of Moscow, Idaho, that's people who actually live within the city limits, is about 25,800 or so, 850 from what I'm seeing in my quick Google search. And it's a college town. So a lot of the people who are there during the school year are college students. So think about how small a population, a city of 25,000 is. It's incredibly small. And that is a police department that's used to patrolling around. You got drunk kids on campus and off of campus, having parties. not a lot of homicides there. That's why the FBI, the Idaho State Police, many agencies were assisting with this case as it progressed from the investigative stage and now to the prosecutorial stage, where there are assistant attorney generals helping the prosecution. Let's ask another question. This one is from Butterfly Dana from YouTube. Has anything been found out about the grand jury hearing that happened where Kohberger's parents went before? I'm not going to throw that to anybody. I'm going to tell you, we've done a lot of digging on that issue. We can't tell you exactly what that grand jury proceeding was about. We know that they were subpoenaed, both the mother and the father. There was a lot of talk that it was related to another homicide investigation, but we really can't go into much detail about that. Our next question comes from Facebook. It is Carlotta Alford from Facebook. What led up to him actually taking a human life? Michael Bryant, we just don't know the answer to that question. What led up for him ultimately to actually take a human life?
Yeah, I mean, let the speculation begin. That's one of the challenges of a gag order, is that, the speculation goes rampant as to, in this case, why he may have done it, how it was done, if he did it. And so this specific question really gets into the weeds here. How do we know what happened if it was this guy, Mr. Kohberger, who got into that house that day, and some interaction took place that resulted ultimately in the deaths of 4 people? Who knows? Who knows if it was his interaction with one and others came to defend? We know that some were in different rooms and didn't seem to have any prior contact with whomever killed these 4. We don't know. It's total speculation. All we can assume, I think, is that something, this will sound ridiculous, but something went wrong. Something that may have begun as a more normal interaction went horribly wrong.
Something went terribly wrong, and we really don't know. We know that the family of Kaylee Gonsalves, Shannon Gray, the attorney for that family, told me several months back that they had done some digging. They did not believe Kaylee had any interaction with Bryan Kohberger. And so we don't know. There's so much about this case that we don't know. We'll do one more question. This one is from Tiffany Campbell from TikTok. Is Bryan the only suspect in this? Bobby Chacon. As far as we know, Bryan Kohberger is the only one charged in this case.
Yeah, I believe it's safe to assume that he's the only suspect right now that took part in this homicide. I mean, there are other probably things and avenues to look at, whether somebody helped him avoid capture or avoid suspicion, after the fact, kind of accessory after the fact type of behavior. There was some talk about maybe his father knew when they were driving across country, but not that the father ever knew beforehand. So, and that's all speculation. So I think that at this point in time, there's only reason to believe that he is the only suspect. I think that if they've moved along in this case so far now into the court proceedings, that if there was another suspect, they would have had to alert the defense to it. They would have had to, probably made a public statement about that, because you're talking about dangerous and violent criminals out in the community. And I would hope that they would make the public aware of that.
Well, and if somebody else happened to be involved in this, if they believed somebody else was involved, that could possibly help Bryan Kohberger's defense, because they could say, this wasn't our guy, it was that other guy. And I know there's a lot of stuff that's gone on social media, a lot of discussion and speculation, but we are just going to bring you the facts as we know them right now, and the allegations. Bryan Kohberger, of course, presumed innocent until proven guilty. And they say he did it, the state does, but at this point, he says he's not guilty and he's going to trial. We are going to continue to take your questions, but first we need to take a quick break, so keep them coming to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. We've got you covered everywhere, so we'll be right back. Stay with us. I'm Anjanette Levy, and you are watching the Q&A Lunch Show on Law and Crime. Welcome back, and thanks for joining us. I'm Anjanette Levy, and you are watching Law and Crime. We are taking your questions this hour about the case against Bryan Kohberger in Idaho. He is accused of murdering those 4 University of Idaho students in their off-campus home last November. He is asking the court to ban cameras from his upcoming trial. We are opposed to that as members of the media, so we formed a coalition. We're asking Judge John Judge to allow cameras at proceedings moving forward and at the upcoming trial. Also, the media is asking that a gag order in the case be vacated, meaning be tossed out, because it's so broad. It doesn't allow for really any information about the case to be released. And the state and the defense, they disagree with that position. They want this gag order to remain in place. They argued for it and formed this gag order. They agreed to it early on in the case. So we have a couple of different hearings going on regarding this issue today. As soon as we get video of that hearing that's scheduled to start at 1:30 Eastern time, we will turn it around for you. There's no live streaming allowed in Idaho. So we're just really waiting for that video from the hearing, which could take anywhere from, it could be 20 minutes, it could be a half hour. We just don't know. But stay tuned, because we will bring it to you as soon as we get it. We are taking your questions, so keep those coming to us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. This next question is going to go to Michael Bryant, an attorney and host here at Law and Crime. It's from Lisa B., Michael, and she asks, how is Bryan Kohberger, she calls him BK, allowed to dictate whether or not cameras are allowed at his trial?
Well, if nothing else, I think Lisa B. has convicted Bryan Kohberger of something. I'm not sure he's the guy making the decisions here, so let's talk about how this plays out. Both sides in this case want cameras banned from the courtroom. Each side makes their position known to the court. The court then rules. The big decision here is, get ready because this will be on the final, it's the 6th Amendment. I mean, to what degree, if any, will cameras in the courtroom affect this man's right to a fair trial? That's what it's all about, and that's why it is so insular in how it's evaluated by each judge. In Idaho, it's totally up to the presiding judge to determine whether or not cameras are allowed, to what extent they're allowed. And you just mentioned, Anjanette, the streaming delay. We don't get it live. That's also something they can deal with and allow or disallow. So, does Bryan Kohberger want no cameras? Yes. Prosecution doesn't want cameras either. Nobody wants cameras except everybody outside that courtroom. And, hopefully today that will be resolved in the favor of the public.
And one of the things the prosecution said in its motion or memo about this item is that they were going to leave it up to the sound discretion of the court. That's how Bill Thompson, the Latah County prosecutor, worded it. And he said, they have witnesses who could be harassed. There's been a lot of social media bullying in this case. They're worried about that. They're worried about the possible impact on the jury and jurors being able to go home at night and watch the footage, maybe see arguments outside the presence of the jury. They said, though, they kind of threw the media a little bit of a bone. They said, look, if the judge allows the cameras, we want the court to control it, how close the cameras can be to people, etc. But it seems like they would rather cameras not be allowed. We are big proponents of allowing cameras. And, recently we saw in Idaho for the trial of Lori Vallow Daybell, Joseph Scott Morgan, they didn't allow cameras. Both sides asked that cameras be barred, and we got audio at the end of the day. We posted that, but there's nothing like being able to actually see it. And there are measures that can be taken so that cameras aren't right up in people's faces. These cameras these days are pretty small. They're not like the giant TV cameras that we used to have.
Yeah, you don't have that encumbrance in the courthouse, with this gigantic piece of equipment in there. And look, kudos to you guys, because you were there, 24/7, hanging out. I saw all of you in your cold weather gear, having to hang out there and endure. And so, you have to make it happen. And there is nothing like, having, that kind of dose of reality where you're watching these things in real time. But I think that they make a valid point. There were, remember with Daybell, there was a question about them zooming in on her face at some point in time and one of these hearings, and you're catching some kind of reaction. They want to avoid that minefield at all costs. And again, going back to this idea of the populace and the limited populace that you have as far as the jury pool goes. I think that can be quite impactful in the decision making.
And you know, a camera doesn't have to be right in someone's face. I mean, the camera can be positioned farther out, or limits can be put on how tight the shots can be. We saw that in the Chauvin trial in Minnesota, where cameras aren't even allowed. Cameras are not allowed in the courtroom in Minnesota, but Judge Peter Cahill made an exception in that case because of the importance of that case to people around the world, and they wanted to show that they could conduct this trial in the proper fashion. It was all about a police officer killing George Floyd and whether or not he was guilty of a crime or not. And Judge Cahill changed his mind about cameras. He believes they're a good thing in the courtroom. Our next question, Bobby Chacon, I'm going to send over to you. It comes from Dark Song on YouTube. Dark Song asks, do you think that Bryan Kohberger, when entering his plea, he stood silent? He didn't say not guilty. He said that we're going to stand silent. That's what his lawyer said. And then the judge entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. Do you think that he stood silent because he's anticipating a plea deal? What are your thoughts, Bobby, on him standing silent?
He did that most likely on the advice of his counsel. Hopefully he's listening to his lawyer. He should. And you know, plea deals can be made no matter what somebody says on the record in an earlier hearing or things like that. So I don't put too much into it. That wouldn't affect his ability to get a plea later on. They wouldn't hold that against him if he said he wasn't guilty. I mean, there was some reporting that he sent word through his lawyer or through a representative that he looked forward to be exonerated. So he clearly has pled not guilty. He clearly is heading towards a courtroom trial during which his lawyers will expound on his innocence, and certainly is not guilty in this case. But again, a plea deal can come at any time, right up until jury selection. So and very little in the lead up will affect that plea deal. And so I don't think him standing silent is very impactful.
Mm-hmm. It's basically the same thing as entering a not guilty plea. It's just obviously a choice they decided to make. Our next question is from your Clarkness from TikTok. Michael Bryan, I'll send this one to you. If the argument for no cameras is the fragility of witnesses, could they just not show their faces? I think that's a good point. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, and you know, it's a matter of degree, and we've seen all kinds here at the network, from just audio to just their bodies not showing their faces. We've seen it all, and obviously we're spoiled and we're greedy. We want to see the whole package because you learn so much more seeing the nonverbal. But yeah, that could be done, and it's done all the time when minors are involved, and so certainly it could be done, but it's not. You know, I got a little annoyed last time at the Lori Vallow scenario because they were doling out the audio only on a delayed basis, and at a certain point it almost felt like, you know, what's the point? If you're going to allow it, let's allow it. Unless somebody has some concerns, you know, they're undercover officers or they're underage, if there's some reason they really need to have their visual identity masks, great, let's do it. But not as a matter of course. I just don't think it's the way to do it. Let it all hang out as if we're in the courtroom.
I think you make a good point there, and I will tell you, Michael and Bobby and Joseph and everybody, that when we were planning for that trial, we were in a meeting, and I asked that question, could you please allow us to live stream the audio at least? And they said no, because they didn't want sidebars to be overheard by the public. But there are many ways to address that concern. They can just mute the mics during the sidebars. If you want to transcribe those, just let the court reporter hear what's going on. We cover this stuff all the time. We know how to do this. All right, we know how to do it responsibly. We are going to take a quick break. Stay with us. If you're watching on YouTube, please stay with us because we just have to take a quick break for the network. We will be right back. Keep the questions coming on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We'll get to as many of them as we can. I'm Anjanette Levy, and you're watching Law and Crime. Welcome back. I'm Anjanette Levy, and we are taking your questions about the trial and the case of Bryan Kohberger, the Washington State University PhD student accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students last November in Moscow, Idaho. It's a case that has captured the attention of people around the world. Quite literally, it's discussed on social media constantly, and many, many news stories are published about it. It feels like daily and sometimes weekly. So we are taking your questions, as I mentioned. Keep them coming to us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. We will get to as many of them as we can. We have a great panel here to discuss this with you as we await footage from a hearing that is starting right about now in the case, and it's regarding a gag order that prohibits family members and their lawyers, family members of the victims, from talking publicly about the case to news media and others, although we have seen them speak and say a couple of things here and there despite the gag order. So they want that tossed out, as we do too. There is a media hearing on this issue and cameras in the courtroom later in the day, and we will, of course, bring that to you later on our YouTube channel. But first, let's get back to your questions. We have a great panel here. Bobby Chacon, a retired FBI agent and lawyer. Joseph Scott Morgan is a forensic death investigator and host of the Body Bags podcast. And Michael Bryant is a lawyer and host here at Law and Crime. So let's get to our next set of questions. No live streaming allowed in Idaho or court-by-court basis. This is from Toby Walker. So Bobby Chacon, talk to us a little bit about that, how it works. Does it go court by court, state by state? How does this work?
Well, each state sets its own rules, and then it goes down to, you know, the counties and the chief judges in those districts, those judicial districts. But in Idaho, from my understanding, is it actually goes all the way down to the trial judge, and the trial judge can restrict or expand the coverage of the cameras in the courtroom as they see fit. And so, you know, both sides make their desires known about what's shown or if anything is shown. And then the trial judge makes the ultimate decision in Idaho as to how many cameras, what they're going to show, if they're going to be there at all. So I think there's a lot of discretion sent all the way down to the trial judge level in Idaho, and that's, I think, where we're going to see the decisions made. You know, I don't know about the appellate process, whether they can appeal those decisions above the trial judge level, but in the first instance, the trial judge will make the decision on if there's going to be cameras and the limitations on the cameras in his courtroom.
It's definitely all up to the judge. So Judge John Judge has a big decision to make. So we'll be waiting for that decision. We, of course, would like cameras in the courtroom so we can bring this case to the public, because it's a public trial. And in 2023, this is how public trials are conducted, and we can do it responsibly. Our next question comes from Polly the Greaser on Twitter. Michael Bryant, is there actual evidence that Kohberger interacted with one of the victims online, or is that just rumor?
Yeah, again, the speculation is far more easy to find than any facts. That's what we're hearing. There seems to be evidence that there was some social interaction. I don't know what that means. I don't know how specific it got, if it did happen. Maybe it was just random posts by Kohberger that have been somehow attributed to a connection between him and one or some of the victims in this case. We just don't know. And that's, you know, the gag order, I think, can be a good thing. It's always one of degree. And I think at a certain point, especially in this particular case, when you're gagging parents, family members, you know, I kind of like the First Amendment. And I think you can't go that far. I can see officials involved, investigators involved, but when you start reaching out beyond that, it's just too much. So that little nugget of information could be buried there in some of that gagged material. At this point, it is just rumor, speculation.
And we are big fans of the First Amendment here at Law and Crime. And another thing about this gag order, they call it a non-dissemination order, that's been so concerning is not only does it gag the victims' families and their representatives. Of course, we know that they don't want extrajudicial statements. They don't want the prosecutor on the courthouse steps commenting on the case and saying terrible things to taint the jury pool. But one thing that's been concerning is that simple records requests, and I actually had to fill out some paperwork regarding this, simple requests for records that we are usually able to obtain have been denied because of this non-dissemination order. So that's really one of the major concerns. and that's why the media is asking as a coalition to vacate this order and amend it. Let's ask this question, Joseph Scott Morgan, to you, Achilles X from YouTube, and this is kind of speculation as well. Was he active on social media platforms after committing the crime? And I think that we need to keep in mind that Bryan Kohberger is innocent until proven guilty. But I think this question refers to that Papa Roger profile on Facebook, Joseph Scott Morgan, if you know what I'm talking about. It was the one constantly asking questions and saying things about the crime scene.
Yeah, and there has been a lot of speculation. Again, back to the word, Michael's talking about here over and over again. I've heard a lot of this. I've had a lot of people ask me questions about this handle and the information that was being, sought allegedly in that context. How do you go about validating that? I mean, I'm no forensic digital evidence examiner, so I can't validate it out here. I don't have access to that data. I would urge people to be very, very careful about this. And, this goes back to a thought that I had a moment ago. You were talking about how broad ranging this case is, how there's eyes on this case from all over the world. And there are a lot of bad actors out there. We see these people, that kind of float through social media. And many of them are merely provocateurs, if you will. So, this goes to, you don't know how to validate a lot of this data. And again, I think that, when you begin to think about these gag orders and these sorts of things, as it applies to the investigators, that's one of the reasons they want to try to play things very close to the vest, because at this point, it's all speculation.
Mm-hmm. Most certainly. It is all speculation. I think everybody needs to kind of take a deep breath, step back a little bit, and just realize there is so much about this case we still don't know. There's just so much we don't know. We just know a little sliver from what we've been able to glean from that probable cause affidavit that was filed with the court when the charges were initially filed back on December 30th. This next question will be for you, Bobby Chacon. Annette Corbis from YouTube. What are your thoughts on the roommate? Was she involved in some way, or do you think that she is not? I think they're talking about the roommate who told police that she saw a man clad in black, bushy eyebrows, walk past her bedroom door. She heard crying and yelling, and then she goes back in her bedroom. There was also a second surviving roommate on the first floor of the house. So what are your thoughts on the surviving roommate? I'm pretty sure this question pertains to the one that says she saw a guy in all black.
Sure. I don't think there's ever been any implication or evidence to point that roommate was involved at all. I think that they were the victim of a horrible traumatic incident that makes people behave differently than we believe. I think there's been a lot of speculation on her behavior. I think most of it has been unfair. I think that, there's a lot of different reasons why he would have walked right past her. We might get those answers during trial. And I've heard some things about that and why that might have happened, but I don't think there's any indication, any evidence, or anything to point that roommate might have been involved in the crime itself. I think that they were there. They were traumatized by seeing him. His reason for not attacking the roommate. There's a variety of reasons he might not have done that, and so I think that we need to give that person a lot of room because they're processing a lot. And they probably will be for a long time to know that they were in that house and they were spared and know what happened to their friends, just a few feet away. I think that they're a witness to this crime. We need to give them the space and the support that they need.
I think that I want to add on to that a little bit, Bobby. This happened at 4 a.m. The kids were all out partying. That's our understanding from our reporting on this case. They had been out and about, maybe some alcohol involved, some of them asleep. Some of these people, Maddie and Kaylee, were believed to be sleeping when they were murdered, when they were stabbed to death. And you don't know how you're going to react to a situation like this. And we don't even know if the person in all black that the surviving roommate saw, whether or not he saw her. So we have no idea. There is so much about that time frame that we don't know. And I think it's important to say, too, that Steve Gonsalves, Kaylee Gonsalves' father, said these are victims, too, the surviving roommates. So, Joseph?
One more point to, what you guys are diving into here. Listen, if it wasn't for this roommate, we wouldn't have the script that we have regarding him. So, before, you start casting stones at this individual, I think that it's very important to remember that. We had a very specific description talking about the being masked up and having the bushy eyebrows and that sort of thing. I don't know who else out there had that information. Well, this person obviously did. So I think that you need to take this in measure as with all things in this particular case, because you would not have had that data. That's probably something that played into the investigation as they're developing all of these leads, the investigators. And I'm sure that they were probably very pleased with having that information. And for anybody to, I think, believe that that person may have been able to interdict anything at that moment in time, quite frankly, they're lucky to be alive.
Very lucky to be alive. And this was a party house, too. There's so much that goes into this, and we really can't judge. You have to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be taking more of your questions. That hearing in Idaho should be underway right now regarding the gag order for the family and the attorney of Kaylee Gonsalves' family. So we're going to take a quick break. Keep the questions coming to us on social media. We'll be right back. I'm Anjanette Levy, and you're watching Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy. Thanks for joining us here on Law and Crime. We are taking your questions live this hour. We are in the middle of a hearing on the gag order for the case against Bryan Kohberger in Idaho. That hearing is underway right now, we believe. In Idaho, we can't live stream things for you, so as soon as we get that video footage about the gag order hearing regarding the family of Kaylee Gonsalves, the other victims, and their lawyer, we will bring it to you and turn it around. But for now, we're going to continue to take your questions, and we have a great panel here to do that. Our next one is from Kevin Rose from YouTube. Michael Bryant, you've covered a lot of cases over the years. I like this one for you because you covered O.J. Simpson, and that was really the first big murder trial where we saw DNA used and discussed on the stand. So Kevin Rose asks, do you believe that the DNA evidence found on the knife sheath makes this case a slam dunk for the prosecution?
You know, anytime you use that phrase "slam dunk," you're doomed. You know, never in this case with that little tidbit of material, and I'm treading on Joseph Scott Morgan's ground here. You know, that in and of itself ain't gonna win the day, in my opinion. It's certainly not good for the defendant. I don't think it wins the day, and I think if you start going down that road, then you've already kind of made up your own mind. You're looking for reasons to find him guilty.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that any case, you can't really consider any case a slam dunk before you get into the courtroom and see how the evidence comes out from the witness stand, because there are a lot of people who think cases are going to be slam dunks, and then they go in and you start to see the testimony and how it unfolds, and you're like, whoa. So don't count your chickens before they're hatched, that's for sure. Our next question comes from Real with Robo from YouTube. Sixth Amendment, how would that affect his right to a fair trial? The jury doesn't interact with us. As for the witnesses, please, millions of witnesses haven't been harassed yet. Excuses. Joseph, your thoughts on that? You've been involved in the coverage of many cases over the years, also as a death investigator. You've investigated a lot of cases and been on the witness stand.
Yeah, I have. Let's see. I don't know that I can add much clarity to this other than to say we don't want the pool tainted as it applies to potential jury members. But because I think that the judge has to be very careful to measure this, and isn't this very difficult for them in this little corner of the world? You've got all eyes upon this trial, and you're going to have people stepping up onto that stand. And we're not just talking about people that are in law enforcement. We're talking about day-to-day, everyday folks. Is there a potential that they could be harassed, bullied, that they could be in fear, you know, of what's going to happen to them? And so it's a terrible position to be in as a witness. And let's face it, these people probably want to speak about this. They want to, you know, say what they saw. And then you add, and it's a horrible position to be in to begin with, then you add this on top of it, and the judge has to be very careful about this and watch after these witnesses.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. And we don't want anybody harassed. That's not the point of these trials. The point is to see if the state can prove its case and if there can be justice meted out by the courts. Our next question, Omar asks from YouTube, what are your thoughts, Bobby Chacon? This is for you. What are your thoughts about his father being with him on that long trip after the murders? Doesn't it seem like he had some level of knowledge about what occurred? So what are your thoughts on Michael Kohberger doing that cross-country trip, Bobby, with his son as the holidays approached?
Yeah, I found that a little bit odd because, you know, I was a college student and I actually lived, you know, another state away from where my parents were. And so you think about it, he bought that car, I think it was a 7-year-old car, probably a lot of miles on it, drove it out from Pennsylvania out to Idaho. And this was basically his first break, his first holiday break going back. I mean, I don't know what the higher percentage is. I would imagine it's 90% of students fly home for their break. I always flew home, you know, if you can afford it. And so to put an older older car that basically he bought just to be in Idaho, to put all those miles on, driving all the way across. You know, you're not saving any money because the gas alone, and then the father had to buy a ticket to fly out there and then probably drive across, and then, you know, so there were airline tickets involved anyway. So I don't see it as a cost saving, and so I've really kind of run it over in my head. Why drive back? You were going to go back to Idaho anyway after the holiday break, so why drive all the way, the cost of hotels and gas and food for the 3 or 4 days that it's going to take you, and then, you know, the father's plane ticket. It just didn't make much sense. Now, I don't know if the father had any idea. Now, by the time they made that trip, it was already known in the public that they were looking for a white Elantra. That, you know, the father had to know that the son had a white Elantra and lived about 10 miles away. So he's in a white Elantra leaving, you know, that area. And so, you know, I don't know. It does kind of make me curious about the father's behavior and the father's knowledge. Of course, there's no evidence that the father knew or did anything wrong, but the situation of driving an older car that you purchased basically to be your campus car and then drive it all the way across country to drive it all the way back, certainly not a financial move. And so I still wonder about that, and the fact that everybody knew that the authorities in that general area were looking for a white Elantra, it does give me pause.
That white Elantra was a needle in a haystack. There are a lot of them, apparently. I do want to just chime in and add that Jason Labar, who represented him, Bryan Kohberger, very briefly in Pennsylvania following his arrest, told me that that was a pre-planned trip at the beginning of the school year. So I will throw that out there. That is what we have been told from the Kohberger camp, but nobody's talking right now. So we have enjoyed taking your questions this hour. As we've been telling you, there is a hearing underway regarding the gag order in this case. There will be another hearing taking place in a couple of hours. So we will bring you the footage from those as soon as we get it and as soon as it's turned around. But for now, I'm going to be signing off. Michael Bryant will be taking over. I'm Anjanette Levy. You've been watching Law and Crime. We'll be right back.